The other one thing I want to mention is Zandring made a comment about wind turbines and the deficit, the carbon deficit. And I just want to mention that I think there are a number of studies that would suggest, one in particular that I can post, that did a very extensive analysis of this, of the manufacturing, of the breakdown of old turbines, of the maintenance, of the nacelle production. Their assessment is that the carbon payback occurs at around 9 months for a 1 to 2 megawatt wind turbine. So that's pretty damn good for a turbine that's going to be around for 10, 15 years. So while I would agree that we need to study these kinds of things, I want to look to actual peer-reviewed papers that evaluate these kinds of topics. So I think that those are important subjects to think about, but I just want to make sure that we have the right information on that.
I can agree. Yeah, the IPCC report says the same thing.
I want to point out that I'm not specifically quoting any studies. I'm quoting what the people are talking about. The average person. I saw an entire presentation from an engineer that went through and said, "Look, this is all of the materials that go into it. There's this much steel. This is the process for making steel. This is how much CO2 is emitted." And he went through every single step for every single piece of material in the entire production of all of the materials in there, and was like, and then just did math. And it's like any regular person watching that is going to come away not believing you or either of you. Period. You're going to say there's a really good peer-reviewed study on this. They're going to say, don't care. It was laid out in black and white math right there. Very easy to understand. You're simply wrong. And I'm not going to bother reading, these. Go search down and possibly have to pay to get a research paper that shows the other another view of it. They're not going to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's just going to be cheaper in the end, and it's just economically, it's kind of like fracking, where fracking is just cheaper than coal. It just is. Those type of methods are just going to be cheaper. And I mean, the cost of those materials over time, the IPCC 6th assessment has a really good graph where it's just dropping, logarithmically right now, just the cost of those things. So I don't know what numbers they're using, that could have been like 10-year-old numbers or something like that. And he was computing in how much it's being used today, that kind of thing. I guess I'm skeptical of anything, but at IPCC level is usually pretty good. It's thousands of authors that are
right. And I'm not saying he very well probably was taking the absolute worst. Like this is a coal-fired plant that's powering everything that's doing. I mean, I'm sure he took the worst. I can look at it and say, okay, I need to see where you're getting these numbers from, but the average person isn't. They're not that. I mean, that's my point. The only reason I bring it up is I'm not trying to tell you that this is true. I'm telling you that there are very well put together presentations that break things down in a very simplistic way, probably overly simplistic, that the average person, when you read all the comments, it's like the average person buys into that right now. And you saying, well, there's IPCC study, and their eyes glaze over. And they're like, I don't care. Yeah. I don't even know what that is. I'm not going to go look for it. I probably have to pay for it if I do look for it to get it. And then how am I even going to understand what's written there? Because most scientific peer-reviewed studies are not easily understood by the layman. So that's the deficit you have to overcome.
And it's not just so. Here's an interesting point, which is, and I think he said something which I think most of us agreed with, which is people will hear this guy giving a what feels like a scientific presentation, what seems like good numbers, and they will hear that and they'll believe him, and they won't believe somebody else who maybe has researched this a ton more and actually understands it a bit better. And it seems to me that one of the reasons is because we're more likely to believe what we want to hear. So is the problem the scientific numbers, and is the problem the presentation, or is it in this case that we're whether or not it's feeding the biases we already have? Or not just biases, let me rephrase that. I mean, it's like, I would rather hear a scientist come on and say, windmills aren't going to solve the problem, guys, so let's not even bother trying. I want to hear that, right? Because then that means I don't have to do anything. So when somebody comes on and says, here's all the math and here's all the numbers and here's all the reasons why it's not going to work and it's not really that big a deal, the numbers and math don't turn me off at that point, right? Because I've already bought into, I have some reason to buy into what he's saying, whether it's true or not. When a scientist comes in and says, well, here's the hard reality of it, and if they try the same technique, it's not going to work. Does that seem fair? Am I off base? And is that a problem? And if so, how do we address it?
Excellent points by Izandrig and you, Nick. That the issue of, and this gets to the heart of this scientific communication aspect, which is when we have a world that learns off of Facebook posts and Twitter feeds and, the 2-minute YouTube video that I watched from somebody that I don't know where that came from, but it strikes true to me that it might have some like ulterior motives of like, oh, I don't have to do anything. I want to believe this more. Like, competing against that, like scientists trying to compete against well-polished, I don't want to say propaganda pieces, but pieces that somebody puts out on Facebook that goes viral is a real challenge. And I'm not necessarily sure that I have the answer to that. I mean, when somebody puts out something and says, hey guys, I've done the math on this, look at this, this, and this, guess what? Wind turbines, not worth it. That's a problem. I have
the answer.
What's the answer?
The answer is to start teaching kindergartners philosophy and critical thinking and teach them every year until they graduate. That's the answer. And I have a feeling that we aren't solving these problems until that happens.
I think that that's part of the answer, but I think that the problem is that I'm not sure that we have the political and economic will to educate everybody to a level where they can spot these kinds of false bits of information. And can we stay ahead of the curve? Because the curve is changing as we speak of the ability to communicate misinformation in ways that convinces people to rile them up into a tribe to be able to riot against the powers that be. How dare you climate scientists try to take this money away from us? I think that is a real challenge. So I agree. It is the educational process. Maybe it is teaching critical thinking in a better capacity at younger ages, but it's also maybe even addressing the heart of some of these problems of misinformation, preventing that from happening. That's a whole other problem that I'm not sure how feasible it is or not. It runs up against First Amendment rights and freedom of expression. And so I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but it's a big problem.